Turn 4, Daytona International Speedway, February 18, 2001. 10 seconds left in the race. A black number 3 Chevrolet drifts low, almost casually, across the track, and in that single heartbeat, before the wall, before the silence in the broadcast booth, before an entire sport stopped breathing at once, nobody watching had any idea they were about to witness the death of the most feared driver who ever sat behind a wheel. To understand how a man who had survived nearly 30 years of the most violent sport in America died on a lap that looked, at first glance, almost harmless, you have to go back to a mill town in North Carolina, decades before anyone called him the Intimidator. Was Dale Earnhardt was born in 1951 in Kannapolis, North Carolina, a textile town where his father, Ralph Earnhardt, raced cars on dirt tracks after long shifts to feed his family. Dale dropped out of school in the 9th grade. He wanted to race, and nothing else mattered enough to keep him in a classroom. He worked in a textile mill himself. He installed insulation. He did whatever paid enough to keep gas in a car that barely ran, and he chased local short-track races across the Carolinas with the kind of hunger that only comes from having nothing to fall back on. He married young. He struggled financially for years. By his own account, there were seasons where he could not afford tires, where he borrowed engines, where the idea of NASCAR's biggest stage felt like a fantasy reserved for men with sponsors and money and connections he simply did not have. He got his shot anyway. In 1979, Dale Earnhardt won NASCAR's Rookie of the Year. The very next season, in 1980, he did something almost no one has ever done before or since. He won the championship. Not Rookie of the Year twice in a row, the actual Winston Cup championship, in only his second full season. It was the kind of jump that should not happen in a sport built on experience and machinery and money, and it announced to the entire garage that something different had just arrived. Over the next 2 decades, Earnhardt built a reputation that went far beyond wins. He drove the number 3 car for Richard Childress, racing with a style that other drivers described, sometimes admiringly and sometimes furiously, as fearless to the point of reckless. He would run you into the wall to make a pass and wink about it afterward. He would find grip on a track surface that seemed to have none. Fans either loved him with a devotion bordering on religious, or they despised him, and there was almost no middle ground, which is exactly why he earned the nickname that stuck for the rest of his life, the Intimidator. By the time the new millennium arrived, Dale Earnhardt had won 7 Winston Cup championships, tying the all-time record, and 76 career Cup victories. He had also, by that point, walked away from more violent, twisted, sport-wrecking crashes than almost any driver in the sport's history, and every single time he had climbed out, dusted himself off, and gotten back in the car. In 1996, at Talladega, his car got turned into the wall at nearly 200 miles an hour, flipped violently onto its roof, and slid upside down for what felt like an eternity to everyone watching. Earnhardt climbed out of that wreckage under his own power, with a cracked sternum and a broken collarbone, and famously climbed back into a backup car to start the very next race a week later, waving to the crowd as if nothing had happened. In 1997, at the Daytona 500 itself, his car flipped end over end down the front stretch, landing on its roof in a cloud of dust and debris, and he still climbed out, still finished the season, still kept racing like it was simply part of the job description. Stories like these were not rare footnotes in his career. They were the foundation of his legend. Every driver in that garage had personally watched Dale Earnhardt survive collisions that, on paper, should have ended far worse than they did, and it built a kind of collective, unspoken belief throughout the entire sport that this particular man, whatever else might be true about racing's dangers, was simply not going to die in a stock car. That belief is exactly what makes what happened next so difficult to comprehend, even now, more than 2 decades later. February 18th, 2001, the Daytona 500, NASCAR's biggest race, the season opener, the one every team circles on the calendar before the year even begins. Dale Earnhardt was 49 years old, driving the same black number 3 good-wrench Chevrolet that fans across the country could recognize from a quarter-mile away. But this particular Daytona 500 carried a strange, almost domestic tension for him, because it was not really his race to win that day. 2 cars ahead of him, running 1-2 at the front of the field, were Michael Waltrip, driving for Earnhardt's own new team, Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, in Waltrip's first race for that team, and Dale Earnhardt Jr., his own son, driving the sister DEI car. For the final laps, Dale Earnhardt was not racing to win. He was racing as a blocker, a rolling wall of protection behind his son and his driver, holding off the cars behind him so that his own team could take first and second in the biggest race in the sport. It is one of the most quietly emotional details of that entire day. A 7-time champion, at the absolute peak of his fame, spent the last minute of his life not chasing glory for himself, but shielding the 2 people who mattered to him most on that track. As the field came off turn 3 and into turn 4 on the final lap, the pack tightened the way it always does at Daytona, cars running inches apart at nearly 200 miles an hour, drafting off each other's bumpers in a blur of noise and heat. Behind Earnhardt, Sterling Marlin's car made contact, seemingly minor, the kind of contact that happens dozens of times in a single Daytona 500 without consequence. But at that speed, on that angle, minor is a word that means almost nothing. Earnhardt's black Chevrolet turned sharply down the track into the path of Ken Schrader's car, and the 2 machines came together again, this time harder. What happened in the next fraction of a second has been studied, frame by frame, more than almost any moment in American motorsport history. Earnhardt's car, now turned nearly sideways, launched off the racing line and drove almost head-on into the concrete retaining wall in turn 4. Not a glancing blow, not a slide along the wall the way so many crashes end. A direct, nearly perpendicular impact at a combined speed that investigators would later place at well over 160 miles an hour of closing force. On the broadcast, the call from the booth in that instant carried the strange, deceptive calm that always seems to follow a crash at Daytona, because crashes at Daytona happen constantly, and drivers climb out of them constantly. And for 1 or 2 more seconds, nobody in that stadium, nobody in that broadcast truck, and nobody watching at home had any reason to believe this was different from the dozens of other times they had watched the number 3 hit a wall and walk away. The car came to rest at the base of the wall, and it did not move. In racing, that stillness is the detail that changes everything. A driver who is conscious moves. He reaches for a belt. He waves an arm out the window. He unfastens his helmet. Anything to signal to the safety crews and the cameras that he is alive in there. Dale Earnhardt's car sat motionless in the grass below turn 4, while, just a few hundred yards ahead, Michael Waltrip crossed the finish line and won his first Cup race in over 460 career starts, with Dale Earnhardt Jr. finishing second directly behind him. For a few surreal minutes, NASCAR's biggest storyline of the day was Waltrip's improbable, emotional first win for Earnhardt's own team. Nobody in victory lane yet understood that the man they were about to celebrate was already dying in the car behind them. Earnhardt suffered what medical examiners later confirmed was a basilar skull fracture, a catastrophic injury at the base of the skull caused by the violent, whipping forward motion of his head at the moment of impact, when his restraint system failed to keep his upper body from snapping toward the steering wheel. It is the same category of injury that had already killed several other drivers in stock car racing over the previous years, injuries that occur in a fraction of a second and leave almost no time between the impact and the end. Emergency crews extracted him from the car and rushed him to Halifax Medical Center in Daytona Beach. He was pronounced dead there at 5:16 in the afternoon, Dale Earnhardt, 7-time champion, the most feared driver in the history of the sport, a man who had walked away from wrecks that destroyed cars beyond recognition, was gone on the last lap of the biggest race of the year, in a crash that from the grandstands had looked almost survivable. Word did not reach the public immediately. For nearly 2 hours after the checkered flag, NASCAR officials, doctors, and Earnhardt's own family knew, while millions of fans across the country still believed they had simply watched an exciting, hard-fought finish to the Daytona 500. When NASCAR President Mike Helton finally stepped in front of the cameras that evening, his voice noticeably unsteady, and confirmed that the sport had lost Dale Earnhardt. The reaction across the country was less like reading a news headline and more like an entire community losing a family member at the exact same instant. Grown men who had never met him stood in driveways and garages across the South, unable to process what they were hearing. Talk radio lines lit up for days. Flags at speedways across the country flew at half-mast. It was, by many measures, one of the largest single outpourings of public grief the sport of racing had ever witnessed, and it did not fade quickly. What made the loss even harder to process was what came out in the days and weeks afterward. Dale Earnhardt had refused, for years, to wear a hands device, the head and neck safety restraint that stabilizes a driver's head during violent impact, and was already known, even at that time, to reduce the risk of exactly the kind of basilar skull fracture that killed him. He found it restrictive. He found it uncomfortable. He was, by nearly every account from people who knew him, a man who trusted his own instincts over new equipment, a mindset that had served him well for 3 decades of racing. And crucially, the device was not mandatory in NASCAR at that time, so the decision was entirely his own to make, race after race, for years without incident, until the one afternoon it mattered more than any other decision he ever made behind the wheel. Investigators also found that his seatbelt may have failed or shifted at the moment of impact, which some analysts believe contributed to the violent forward motion that caused the fatal fracture, a theory that led to a bitter, highly public dispute between his family, his seatbelt manufacturer, and NASCAR itself over exactly what had gone wrong inside that cockpit in the final fraction of a second. Autopsy photographs became the subject of an entirely separate legal battle after a Florida newspaper sought access to them for independent analysis, and Earnhardt's widow, Teresa Earnhardt, fought publicly and successfully to keep them private, a fight that ultimately led to new Florida legislation restricting public access to autopsy photographs, a legal legacy almost as significant in its own way as the safety reforms that followed on the track. In the immediate aftermath, in the confusion and raw grief that followed, blame turned towards Sterling Marlin, the driver whose car had made the initial contact that started the chain reaction. Marlin and his family received hate mail. They received death threats. Strangers decided, within days of a legend's death, that they had found someone to punish for it, despite the fact that the contact between the two cars was the kind of routine, split-second racing incident that happens dozens of times in any given Daytona 500 without consequence. It took Michael Waltrip and Dale Earnhardt Jr. themselves, the two men Earnhardt had been protecting on that final lap, publicly and repeatedly stating that Marlin bore no responsibility for what happened, to begin to quiet the anger directed at an innocent driver who had been caught, through no fault of his own, in a chain reaction that ended a legend's life. And this is where the story of Dale Earnhardt's death becomes something larger than a single tragic afternoon. NASCAR, an organization that had resisted sweeping safety mandates for decades, could no longer avoid the reckoning that his death forced onto the entire sport. Within a short time, the Hans device, the same restraint Earnhardt had refused to wear, became mandatory for every driver in every NASCAR National Series. Soft, energy-absorbing SA-Fear barriers began replacing the unforgiving concrete walls at tracks across the country, walls just like the one in Turn 4 at Daytona that had ended his life. Car construction standards changed, seat design changed. data recorders became mandatory to study impacts scientifically instead of guessing at forces after the fact. In the years since his death, NASCAR has not lost a single driver in a National Series race to a similar impact, a statistic that safety experts directly credit to the sweeping changes forced into existence by the very crash that killed him. It is one of the strangest, most sobering legacies in the history of American sport. The most feared, most fearless driver the sport had ever produced spent his final act, without ever knowing it, making stock car racing safer for every driver who came after him, including his own son, who would go on to race for another 2 decades in a sport transformed by his father's death. Today, the number 3 still carries weight at every NASCAR track in the country. Fans still hold up 3 fingers on the 3rd lap of races at Daytona and Talladega, a silent, spontaneous tribute that started spontaneously in the grandstands and has never stopped. Dale Earnhardt Jr. has spoken publicly many times about carrying his father's legacy while also carrying the memory of that final lap, of watching his own race end in celebration, while, somewhere behind him on the track, his father's life was already ending. What happened in Turn 4 on February 18, 2001, lasted less than 2 seconds from first contact to final impact. And yet those 2 seconds reshaped an entire sport, ended the life of a man who genuinely seemed unkillable, and left millions of fans with the uncomfortable, permanent reminder that in racing, the margin between a routine finish and the end of a legend's life can be smaller than anyone standing in the grandstands that day ever imagined.